This week's political figure episode, we've got the human version of the Nintendo Switch. If Nintendo came out with a Switch because they were trying to keep televisions that, separated colors into black and white from being replaced by televisions that were more inclusive of all the colors. Strom Thurmond. This motherfucker lived for a goddamn century, and he stuck around trying to make the country and the world a shittier place till the very fucking end. Which means there's a lot that I just do not have time to cover, so I apologize in advance if I miss what you feel is the shittiest part about Strom Thurmond. I didn't forget, I just couldn't fit it in. James Strom Thurmond Sr. was born December 5th, 1902 in Edgefield, South Carolina. He got his Bachelor's of Science from Clemson Agricultural College in 1923. In 1925, he raped his family's African-American teenage housekeeper, Claire Butler. Claire gave birth to Essie Mae Washington, a child that Strom knew he was the father of, but kept secret until after his death. In 1930, he was admitted to the South Carolina bar because South Carolina has really low standards on pretty much everything. In the 1930s and early 40s, Strom served as a South Carolina state senator and then a South Carolina circuit judge until World War II broke out. He resigned from the bench and joined the army. He landed a glider at the Battle of Normandy and became a decorated war hero. After the war, he came home and ran for South Carolina governor and won. But there was a storm a-brewing in the Democratic Party at the time, and as it began to strengthen and grow, Strom would become its eye. The Democrats, while progressive and sensible on economic policies, were the socially conservative party of the time. And they were fucking racist. This was really only a contentious issue for Democrats in the South. As the country slowly progressed into being less racist and recognizing that black people were, human, Democrats started platforming more prominent northern politicians like FDR, who had more progressive ideals and messaging. It meant that the party as a whole was starting to pivot towards desegregation and appoint judges that would start seeing segregation as unconstitutional. And this put Southern Democrats, who were still racist as fuck, in a really awkward position. They no longer had a party that on the national scale was fighting for them to keep black people from drinking out of the same water fountain. Strom was like, fine, we don't need you Democrats. I'll go for my own political party with blackjack and hookers, except it'll be called White Jack, because that's what he did. He ran as a third-party candidate under the Dixiecrats or States' Rights Southern Democrat Party or some dumb shit. I don't know. It only lasted a year. Not worth remembering. It didn't work. Truman still won. Not that that was a good thing. Truman was still fucking awful. So after that, Strom went and ran for Senate in 1950 and lost. And then in 1952, still throwing a hissy fit that the Democrats weren't being racist enough for him, he supported Dwight Eisenhower, starting a long tradition of Democrats in the South supporting Republicans for president and Democrats for local seats. In effect, attempting to use their political power to mold the Republican Party into the party that the Democrats used to be. In 1954, Strom ran for Senate again as a write-in candidate and became the first person to ever be elected to the United States Senate as a write-in. As senator, Strom just started using all of his time to bitch and moan and whine about black people being treated like people. After the Brown versus Board of Education ruling desegregating schools in 1954, he, along with some other Southern senators, wrote the Southern Manifesto, starting a long history of white Southerners writing manifestos that don't age well. In response to whiny Southerners ignoring federal civil rights laws, Eisenhower passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And Strom had a temper tantrum toddler meltdown. He threw a fucking hissy fit on the Senate floor, filibustering the bill for 24 hours and 18 minutes. The longest filibuster ever conducted by a single senator. In the 1960 presidential election, he refused to endorse John F. Kennedy for president despite being a fellow Democrat. Kennedy still won South Carolina. Strom and Harry Byrd, who were unpledged electors for the Electoral College, did not give their votes to JFK. And he spent the entire Kennedy administration just being an obstructionist. He wasted a bunch of time bitching about how JFK told him that he couldn't use literacy tests to keep black people from voting anymore. When there wasn't any overt civil rights legislation on the board where he could cry about how black people not being oppressed was oppressing him, he'd switch back to the greatest hits and the king of conservative boogeymen, communism, which was not new. I mean, he said that Truman would lead us to totalitarianism and that desegregation would allow the spread of communism, because that makes fucking sense. So when JFK started his National Labor Relations Boards that facilitated private sector employees forming unions, Strom was like, oh my god, this is just going to lead to communism. There's no other logical way that this could go. Pretty soon we're all going to have to call each other comrade, and poor people won't be allowed to starve to death anymore. It's not the America the founding fathers envisioned. In 1962, Strom was like, we should invade Cuba, because communism. The whole Bay of Pigs thing a year ago went so fucking well. And then in a tragic but ironic turn of events, JFK got into a Ford-built Lincoln and that ended exactly the same as the last time President Lincoln got into a Ford. Probably why all presidents ride around in Cadillacs now. And this made LBJ president, who was a Texas Democrat and a giant racist, but he was also insanely arrogant, and to prove that he had the biggest dick in Washington, he decided that he was going to pass JFK's Civil Rights Act. He lovingly referred to it as the N-word bill the entire time he worked on it, so his heart may not have been in the right place, but all is well that ends well. And it did end well. LBJ's hubris got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. And now the Democrats had passed the most important civil rights legislation since emancipation. Strom responded by crying like a baby, stamping his feet, and becoming a Republican. This was the culmination of the party switch. For any idiot who wants to argue that the party switch never happened, Strom's 1960 election was the last time a Democrat was ever elected to the Senate in South Carolina. But they had the exact same person as senator from 1954 to 2003. And all of those southern states that were so Democrat that they didn't even have a Republican presence all became overwhelmingly Republican in the next couple presidential elections. Fun side note, Reagan switched from being a Democrat to a Republican in the early 1960s too. Wonder what that might have been about. Back to Strom, who was a Republican in 1965, is crying about the Voting Rights Act is going to lead to tyranny because Republicans don't know what words mean. Despite his protests, the Voting Rights Act passed by an even larger margin than the Civil Rights Act, and so that meant that stamping his feet as a Republican was even less effective than him stamping his feet as a Democrat. Then LBJ appointed Thurgood Marshall to be the very first African-American Supreme Court justice. During the Senate committee hearing to approve Thurgood, Strom questioned him for an hour on the most intricate details about the Constitution, trying to get him to crack. Marshall made him look like a little bitch. How refreshing it must have been to see a Supreme Court justice not crying about how much he likes beer. Also in the hearing for Abe Fortas, LBJ's other Supreme Court nomination, he brought a bunch of nudie mags and just started waving them around the Senate, because apparently nudie mags are the fault of the Supreme Court. I don't fucking know. He was clearly losing what little shit he had left to lose at this point. Don't worry, Republicans love senile old men, so he's got a long career ahead of him yet. The following year, he was an early supporter of Richard Nixon, who would go on to carry all of the traditionally Democratic southern states except for Texas. After Nixon's election, Strom pledged to try to reverse the impractical and unreasonable decisions of the Supreme Court, and that he would work with Nixon to get sensible, conservative judges appointed. You know how the Supreme Court's totally fucked today? Right there is where the partisan Supreme Court GOP strategy started that got us here. In 1972, Strom tried to get John Lennon deported as an undesirable alien because he didn't like his political views. And he figured if he could get his visa revoked, it would help Nixon's re-election. That's a real thing that happened. In 1973, Nixon was already being investigated for corruption, so he responded by firing the special prosecutor. And Strom and 10 other Republican senators joined together to formally put out their support for Nixon and say they still supported him and this is just a witch hunt and he's being unfairly treated. Doesn't this sound a lot like something you heard before? I just can't put my finger on it. And in the 1977 presidential election, Strom tried to get Southern support for Ford, a man who was born in Nebraska and lived most of his life in Michigan, saying that Ford sounded more like a Southerner than Jimmy Carter, who was a peanut farmer from Georgia. By the 1980 election, since Jimmy is a literal saint, Strom started attacking Billy, his brother. Something about his drinking problems and a connection to Libya, some shit, I don't know. The Hunter Biden laptop bullshit is just the Red Dawn remake of the Billy Carter witch hunt. And after the Reagan election, Republicans controlled everything, and Strom's like, you know what we should do now? More death penalty. He's just like, I don't know why the death penalty is not the punishment for every crime. Kid steals a candy bar, death penalty. Parking meter expired, death penalty. Obviously, I'm joking. Kind of. He did try to push legislation to make the death penalty apply to things like drug offenses and armed robbery. Then he tried to make it federal because, you know, keeping black people from using the same bathroom as him is a states' rights issue. What is it with y'all in bathrooms? It's weird. But making sure that kids get sent to the chair for smoking weed is definitely the federal government's job. 1984 election rolls around and Thurmond runs for his 6th term in the Senate at the age of 81, saying he was as physically fit as a man in his 30s, which I wish we could have made him prove by boxing a man in his 30s. By 1986, Strom managed to get his Anti-Drug Abuse Act passed, and this did include the death penalty for certain drug crimes and has been some of the worst and most damaging legislation in our nation's history. Fast forward a couple years and Daddy Bush appoints Clarence Thomas, the man played by Samuel L. Jackson in Django Unchained, to the Supreme Court. Somewhat surprisingly, Strom supported Stephen for the highest court. I guess if you can find somebody who hates the same people you hate and is also those people you hate, it helps to have friends on the inside. By 1996, Strom became the oldest motherfucker in the history of Washington. He turned 100 years old in 2002. The man predates fucking airplanes and was still a senator when I was 12. On June 26, 2003, Strom, for the first time in his life, did something that made the world a better place. He fucking left it. Sadly, 2 decades later, just like the dozens and dozens and dozens of women that Strom sexually assaulted and harassed over the century he plagued this earth, there is not a single aspect of American politics that doesn't have Strom's fingerprints all over it. And everything else is worse off because of it.